I'm a man in my 30s raising 2 kids, but I have a secret. I've been seeing my aunt. Sounds unbelievable, right? But it's true. I was born in a small town and graduated high school there. Proudly, I was a good student and got into a college in New York. My dad's brother, my uncle, lived near the college. So, under the arrangement that my dad would send boarding money to my aunt, I lived at my uncle's place. My uncle owned an electronics store in a densely populated area. It was always busy and did well financially. My aunt ran a homemade cake shop nearby. Initially, I didn't realize, but her cakes were famous in the area, often praised in local mom groups online. Though small, her shop sold out daily. I learned to bake cakes there whenever I had time. Particularly, a lot of mothers with kids frequented the shop for a slice of cake and a drink. My aunt's freshly brewed coffee and fruit juices were also popular. Thus, each of them ran their businesses successfully. They didn't have children of their own. When I was a kid visiting, my aunt doted on me, often buying me expensive toys. Our family wasn't well off, so those toys kept me entertained for days. But my aunt didn't just spoil me with gifts. When I visited New York as a child, she would eagerly take me to amusement parks, showing a special interest in me. In my 2nd grade, she even called my mom to ask if I could join them for a summer vacation. I vividly remember having a blast at the beach with them, riding a huge two-person too. I have a younger brother, 5 years my junior. Cute as he was, I felt like I lost my mom's sole attention to him. Plus, his meddling with my things was annoying. Childishly, I didn't look out for him as an older brother should. Adults would say, boys will be boys, competing as they grow. My aunt, however, showed me the first signs of affection, often favoring me over my younger brother. On days I didn't have classes, I helped out at my aunt's shop. I engaged with the community online, responding to posts about her shop and sometimes planning promotions. On busy days at my uncle's store, he'd call me in to help, teaching me the ropes. Though financially stable, it seemed like they didn't talk much at home, managing separate stores. Despite their economic comfort, their relationship didn't seem close. Despite everything, my aunt seemed comfortable with me staying over. I found myself relying on her. When I was in college, my aunt was in her late 40s. As summer approached, she began dressing more casually. My aunt was about 5'6" without an ounce of fat on her. Although I never knew her exact weight, she was clearly very slim. I too dressed comfortably at home, and my aunt would wear short shirts and shorts or sometimes a dress. However, I noticed she would occasionally glance over at me, so I started to make sure I was wearing shirts and shorts too. My aunt said it was fine to wear light clothes during the hot weather, but since she wasn't my mom, I felt a bit awkward dressing too casually. My aunt loved wearing a light, aquatic fragrance. My mom, on the other hand, only used skin and milk lotion. I had never seen perfume on her dresser, but being near my aunt, I always caught a fresh, pleasant scent that lifted my spirits. One day, I asked her, "Auntie, can I ask you something? You're so beautiful. I can only imagine how pretty a daughter like you would have been and how well you would have raised her." She didn't respond right away. Bringing up children in front of my aunt was a taboo I was unaware of, but I felt so at ease with her that I asked naturally. There must have been a reason she never brought up the topic of children herself, and realizing this, I covered my mouth with my hand. My aunt then shared, "We wanted to have children too, but it didn't happen for us." People often think having children is a given when you get married, but that's not the case for many couples. I hope when you, Ethan, get married, you'll be blessed with many beautiful children. Tears filled her clear eyes. The mood turned a bit awkward, and suddenly she headed to the kitchen, saying, "How about we have a cold beer?" I offered, "I'll get it, and I'll cut up some mango too." Then she began, "Let me tell you our love story." She was preparing for job interviews in her senior year of college when a professor, who thought highly of her, introduced her to the son of an acquaintance. That man was my uncle. She fell for his healthy, masculine appearance, and after dating for a year, they got married. He would visit her at her office every day for dates. They started off modestly, but as they both worked, their situation improved. They didn't rush into having children, thinking they would enjoy their newlywed life first, but when they eventually tried, they couldn't conceive. After undergoing tests at a renowned hospital, it was discovered that my great-aunt had some health issues that necessitated surgery. Despite this, fate did not bless their home with a child. Initially, my great-aunt was inclined to adopt a child. She met while volunteering at a local orphanage. However, my great-uncle expressed his preference for it to be just the two of them, halting any further discussion on the matter. As his dealership flourished, he became even busier, and my great-aunt too threw herself into her work to avoid dwelling on such thoughts. In my father's family, there are two brothers, my great-uncle and my dad. My great-aunt has younger siblings who have children much younger than me. Among all the relatives from both sides, I am the eldest grandchild. Not to boast, but I am tall and slender. My height shot up because I've been eating double portions since middle school. Somehow all of it went into making me taller rather than heavier. Our family went through tough times, but our fridge was always stocked with meat. I later learned that my great-aunt insisted on providing enough protein for a growing boy. Thus, she sent money for that purpose. She was the one who supported me unconditionally as I grew, from elementary to high school. Every new school year, it was my great-aunt who bought me my backpacks and even supported me with my school uniform expenses. When my mom found it challenging to afford my tutoring fees, she called my great-aunt, who didn't hesitate to support my education. She told my mom that she would spare no expense for my studies, believing in my potential. I only found out about this later and was amazed that we could afford tutoring given our financial situation. Thanks to her support, I was accepted into a university in New York. I expressed my gratitude to my great-aunt, promising to repay her kindness now that I've reached adulthood. She brushed off my offer, telling me that understanding her intentions was enough, and asked me not to worry about repaying her. I was oblivious to the fact that it was thanks to my great-aunt that I could attend a prestigious university. She wanted to support me quietly, promising to share her role in my success later. Despite appearing to live a comfortable life running their businesses, my great-aunt felt a profound loneliness due to not having children. She found solace in a group of women from a local infertility support group who would visit her shop for chats. However, their departure left her feeling even more isolated. Despite her outward smiles, she confessed that living a childless life with her husband was incredibly challenging, breaking down and crying into my lap. In her late 40s, my aunt still radiates beauty, yet the lack of affection in her marriage is palpable. stirring a deep sympathy within me. My heart sank further upon hearing her shocking revelation. My uncle had an affair with a young woman from his office. She confessed she had never shared this with anyone, the shame too great. But today, she felt an overwhelming need to bare her soul. I felt betrayed by my uncle, appalled that he could overlook such a kind and beautiful wife for a younger woman. As my aunt broke down in tears, I gently held her hand, offering a silent comfort. I never thought I'd share this in front of you, Ethan. Thank you for listening. It feels like a weight has been lifted. Please forget everything I've said, okay? Her smile through the tears was heartbreakingly sweet. She seemed to find some peace, lying down on the couch with a serene expression, before drifting into a peaceful sleep. Watching her sleep, emotions poured out, made me realize how deeply these burdens weighed on her. I carried her to bed, her body light in my arms, a stark reminder of her vulnerability. As I was about to leave, she murmured, "Ethan, stay with me tonight." I confessed, "Aunt, living with you, you've occupied my every thought." That night, we shared a connection. Despite her initial hesitation, she welcomed the closeness. It became clear that my uncle, living as if he were single, was far from a good husband. I had planned to work part-time to pay for my classes, but she insisted, "Don't even think about it. Having you by my side is all I need." I stayed by her side, sharing both work and love, until I graduated. We even shared spontaneous moments of love when pressed by urgency. Even after securing a job in New York and fathering a child, I continue to live with her. She still says, "Come over for some cake," a gentle invitation to be together. Now in my 30s, I can't bear to leave her alone. Responding to her texts with a quick excuse to my wife, "I'm off to get some cake," and rushing to her side. I'm in my 30s, but I can't ignore my lonely aunt because she matters to me.
Southern France, in a small peaceful town near Marseille. The house sits on the outskirts, surrounded by olive groves and vineyards, with picturesque views of the French countryside. Leo, 36, is an accomplished architect, and Isabelle, 34, works as a freelance graphic designer. They've been married for 10 years and have an 8-year-old son named Adrien. Pierre, Leo's younger brother, is a 32-year-old real estate agent who visits frequently. It was a Thursday evening, late summer, when Leo's world changed forever. He had always been a man of structure, someone who believed that if you followed the rules, life would follow suit. His days were organized: work, family, a bit of relaxation in the evening. He had his dream job, a beautiful family, and a cozy home, surrounded by the gentle charm of the French countryside. But behind the picture-perfect life lurked a shadow he never saw coming. That evening, Leo was supposed to attend a client meeting that would stretch well into the night. His career as an architect had been demanding lately, but Isabelle, his wife, had always been supportive. She often joked about how their house was his first project, given how meticulously he had designed it from the ground up. Every detail of their home reflected Leo's touch, from the polished oak floors to the wide windows that invited the golden sunsets of Provence into their living room. The house was a labor of love, and Isabelle had been his muse for every step of the process. But tonight, Leo's meeting was canceled. His client, a wealthy investor from Paris, had to reschedule. Leo smiled at the thought of an unexpected evening at home with his family. He decided not to call Isabelle, hoping to surprise her with her favorite dessert, eclairs, from a small bakery in town. Leo imagined her delighted face when he walked through the door earlier than expected. The simple joy of their quiet evening together. The bakery, a small establishment run by an elderly couple, was on the edge of the town square. The scent of fresh pastries filled the air as Leo approached, and he could already taste the creamy filling of the eclairs in his mind. After exchanging pleasantries with the owners, he made his way back home, his heart light. He thought of Adrian, their 8-year-old son, who was probably deep in his homework by now. Adrian was a bright boy, full of curiosity and an eagerness to learn, much like Leo had been at his age. Leo couldn't wait to sit with him and go over his school projects, as he often did after dinner. As he neared the house, Leo noticed something odd, a car parked just down the street. It looked familiar, his brother Pierre's silver sedan. Pierre had been visiting frequently over the past few months. At first, Leo was glad to see more of him. Their bond had always been close. Pierre was charming, outgoing, and a natural flirt, but Leo never thought much of it. They were brothers, after all. Leo brushed off the thought. Pierre probably dropped by for a chat, or maybe to help with something around the house. He hadn't mentioned any plans to visit, but that wasn't unusual. Pierre was spontaneous, often arriving unannounced. Leo didn't mind, and Isabel seemed to enjoy Pierre's company too. They often laughed together, shared jokes that Leo sometimes missed, but he assumed it was just harmless sibling-like banter. Opening the door quietly, Leo stepped into the hallway. The house was unusually quiet. He could hear the faint ticking of the clock in the kitchen and the soft rustling of papers from Adrian's room. Leo smiled, imagining his son buried in his homework, completely focused as always. He set the pastry box down on the kitchen counter and paused. There was something unsettling about the silence. The house felt off. He made his way toward Adrian's room, intending to check in on his son first. As he reached the door, he peeked in and saw Adrian hunched over his desk, his small hand gripping a pencil as he scribbled away. His brows were furrowed in concentration, and Leo felt a surge of pride. He gently closed the door without disturbing Adrian and turned to head upstairs to their bedroom. That's when he heard it, the faint sound of laughter. It was coming from upstairs, from their bedroom. At first, Leo thought it must be the television, or perhaps Isabel on the phone with a friend. But as he climbed the stairs, the laughter grew louder, more intimate. A shiver ran down his spine. Something felt wrong. The bedroom door was slightly ajar, and Leo could hear the muffled sounds of movement. Unmistakable now, the kind of sounds that could only mean one thing. His heart began to race, and he stood frozen in place, unwilling to push the door open, yet knowing he had to. With a trembling hand, Leo nudged the door, and it swung open just enough for him to see inside. What he saw made the blood drain from his face. There, tangled in the sheets, were Isabel and Pierre, his wife and his brother, their bodies entwined. In an act of betrayal so profound, it took Leo a moment to even comprehend what he was seeing. Isabel's hair was tousled, her skin flushed, and Pierre, the man he had trusted his whole life, was there beside her, shirtless, with a look of satisfaction that turned to horror the instant he saw Leo standing in the doorway. The world seemed to stop. The room spun around Leo, and he felt as though the ground had been ripped out from under him. The box of eclairs slipped from his hands, crashing to the floor with a dull thud, the pastries spilling out in a mess of cream and chocolate, forgotten in the chaos of the moment. Isabel gasped, pulling the sheets up to cover herself, her face pale and wide-eyed with shock. "Leo," she whispered, her voice trembling. I didn't mean for you to." But the words stuck in her throat, and she trailed off, knowing there was nothing she could say to make this right. Pierre scrambled to gather his clothes, his face flushed with shame and guilt. "Leo, I'm so sorry. This isn't what it looks like. His voice was desperate, but even he couldn't find the words to excuse what he had done. Leo stood there, rooted to the spot, his mind reeling. How long had this been going on behind his back? He had always trusted them both implicitly. His wife, the mother of his child, and his brother, his closest friend. And now, here they were, tearing his world apart in the most cruel and unforgivable way. For a moment, the only sound in the room was Leo's heavy breathing, the weight of betrayal pressing down on his chest like a stone. He couldn't look at them. He couldn't look at the bed, the sheets, the room that had once been a sanctuary for his marriage. It all felt tainted now, like a lie he had been living without even knowing it. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a door creaking open behind him. Adrian. "Papa," came the soft voice of his son, full of innocence and curiosity. "Are you home?" Leo's heart sank even further. Adrian didn't know what had just happened, didn't know the world he knew was crumbling. He quickly closed the bedroom door behind him, blocking Adrian from seeing the nightmare inside. "Yes, Adrian," Leo called, his voice surprisingly steady despite the storm raging within him. "I'm home. Go finish your homework. I'll be there soon, okay?" "Okay, Papa," Adrian chirped and disappeared back into his room, oblivious to the shattered reality just a few feet away. Leo turned back to Isabel and Pierre, his gaze cold and unforgiving. "How long?" he asked, his voice low but filled with an unmistakable edge. Isabel looked down, unable to meet his eyes, her lip trembling. It just happened. We didn't mean for it to. I don't know how it got this far." Leo's fists clenched at his sides. "My own brother?" he asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. "How could you do this, Pierre? How could you both do this to me?" To Adrian. Pierre, his face now a mask of shame, shook his head, his voice hollow. "I'm sorry, Leo. I never wanted to hurt you." The room felt suffocating, the weight of betrayal pressing in from all sides. Leo couldn't bear to be in the same space as them any longer. He turned away, his chest tight with rage and heartbreak. "Get out," he said, his voice hoarse. "Both of you. I can't look at either of you right now." Isabel reached out, her voice pleading. "Leo, please, don't do this. We can talk about this. I never meant for any of this to happen. I love you." But Leo didn't turn around. "You should have thought of that before. Leave, now." Pierre was the first to move, quickly pulling on his clothes and slipping out of the room without another word, his face a mask of regret. Isabel lingered, tears streaming down her face. But she knew it was too late. She had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. With one last look at Leo, Isabel gathered her things and left the room, the door closing behind her with a finality that echoed through the house. Leo stood alone in the bedroom, his heart heavy with the weight of betrayal. The room felt empty, cold, despite the warm glow of the setting sun that filtered through the windows. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. Adrian. He had to be strong for Adrian. He walked down the hallway, pausing outside his son's room. Leo knocked softly before stepping inside. Adrian looked up from his homework, his bright eyes filled with innocence, completely unaware of the storm that had just passed. "Did you get the eclairs, Papa?" Adrian asked, a hopeful smile tugging at his lips. Leo smiled softly, though it didn't reach his eyes. "I did, but we'll have them later. Let's finish your homework first, okay?" Adrian nodded enthusiastically and returned to his work, completely content in the small bubble of his world. Leo sat beside him, helping him with his math problems, though his mind was far away, lost in the wreckage of what had just happened. He knew that life would never be the same, that trust once broken was almost impossible to rebuild. But for now, he had to focus on what mattered most. His son. Adrian was his anchor in the storm, the one thing that kept him grounded when everything else had fallen apart. Conclusion. Thank you for joining me on this emotional journey of betrayal, heartbreak, and resilience. How would you handle such a devastating discovery? Have you ever experienced something similar? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more gripping stories that explore the complexities of relationships and life. If you have any questions about the story or want to share your insights, feel free to drop them in the comments. I'd love to hear your perspective.
Hi there. I'm a woman in my 30s, and I've been married for 7 years now. My husband and I started dating in our mid-20s during college, and we ended up getting married in our late 20s, which was relatively early for us. To be honest, for the first couple of years of our marriage, we didn't even consider having children. We were actually using contraception, wanting to wait until we felt more settled in our life together. Since we married young, we wanted to enjoy our newlywed life to the fullest before starting a family, and that's exactly what we did. As we combined our lives and finances, we definitely saw ourselves growing faster together. Around our third year of marriage, as we both entered our 30s, we started planning for children. Until then, we thought it would be easy to conceive and start a family. In fact, my first pregnancy happened in our third year of marriage. However, I miscarried at 3 months, and both my husband and I were devastated by the loss. It was heart-wrenching to say goodbye to our first child so unexpectedly. I even quit my job to focus on trying to conceive again. Despite our efforts, 3 more years went by without any success in having a child. We were too proud to even consider visiting a fertility clinic. This could have easily strained our marriage, but it didn't. My husband has always been incredibly supportive, constantly creating special moments in our everyday life. He would take time off work without telling me to plan trips or buy camping gear, so we could travel all over the country together. I loved it. We visited famous restaurants nationwide and enjoyed beautiful scenery, which allowed us to momentarily forget about our struggles with infertility. But those were just temporary escapes. When my husband went to work, I felt utterly alone, struggling to cope. I sought counseling on my own and was diagnosed with depression by a psychiatrist. I tried to keep my medication a secret, but my husband eventually found out. Despite his unwavering support, my depression did not improve, as the root cause was our inability to have a child. Seeing how much I was suffering, my husband encouraged me to take up woodworking, something I had always wanted to learn since our dating days. He gave me some money to enroll in a class, and I booked a one-day workshop at a local woodcraft studio. For the first time in a long while, I felt genuinely excited about learning something new. The class was a mix of various ages and genders. But what really took me by surprise was the instructor. A young, fit instructor in their mid to late 20s led the class. They made rounds to see how the students were doing with their work, and every time they spoke to me or took my hand to show me how to use a tool, my heart felt like it was going to burst out of my chest. My relationship with my husband had become more of an obligation, with our interaction revolving around timing for ovulation, trying for a baby, and facing repeated disappointments. There was no excitement left in it, leaving me feeling quite drained. However, being around the instructor sparked romantic feelings in me. Despite knowing it wasn't right, my heart and mind reacted before I could stop them, almost as if I had a crush on the instructor. Initially, I had intended to attend the class only occasionally, but I found myself constantly thinking about the instructor. This led me to sign up for a month-long course, which eventually turned into enrolling in advanced classes as well. A bond started to form between us, as I found excuses to contact them for help or questions. One day, curious about how it would feel to meet the instructor outside of class, I asked if I could join them on their trip to buy supplies, suggesting it in a hopeful manner. They agreed, saying it would be fun to explore the market together. I was so nervous about asking them that I spent a lot of time getting ready, picking out my clothes and doing my makeup before leaving the house. That day, we bought supplies and had lunch together, enjoying what felt like a date. The instructor would casually touch my shoulder or hold my hand when we were around a lot of people, and I welcomed these gestures, feeling thrilled by the contact. As these days accumulated, my feelings for the instructor grew. Initially, I thought of it as a simple admiration, similar to how one might feel about a celebrity or actor. But even on days when there were no classes, I found myself missing them, and thoughts of the instructor would sneak into my mind even when I was with my husband, making me wonder if my feelings were more than just admiration. I was incredibly confused by my feelings as well. I couldn't quite define it, but I found myself wrestling with the complex idea of loving two people at the same time. One day, when my husband was away on a business trip and I was left alone at home, I felt bored and impulsively decided to visit the workshop where the instructor worked. I arrived just as they were finishing up a class and starting to clean up. They noticed me and asked, "What brings you here?" Trying to act casual, I said, "I was just passing by and got bored." "Have you had dinner yet?" As I helped them with the cleanup. It naturally progressed to me, suggesting we order some takeout and have a drink together. Since we often had meals together, the instructor readily agreed to my proposal. The instructor mentioned they were currently single. Knowing I was married, it somehow felt reassuring to hear that. Without thinking, I quietly said, "That's a relief." I was shocked at my own words, and so was the instructor, who looked at me wide-eyed. We just looked at each other, not saying anything, until the instructor broke the silence by asking, "What's a relief?" Flustered, I blurted out, "It was just something I said. It doesn't mean anything." The instructor then asked, "Really? It means nothing?" before finishing their drink. Not knowing how to respond, I just kept looking at the instructor. After finishing their drink, the instructor moved closer to me, and I found myself naturally drawn to them. That night, we ended up spending time together in the workshop. Even after that night, I continued attending the classes. The instructor began asking me to come in an hour early or stay back after class had ended, suggesting we spend a bit more time together. We also went on many dates under the pretext of buying supplies. It felt like the instructor and I naturally became closer. We drove to secluded spots and even visited restaurants. My husband had introduced me to just the two of us. This was during a time when my husband was deeply engrossed in his work, and I had become noticeably happier since starting my classes, so he was very supportive. In a way, I was comfortably engaging in an affair. Then one day, after feeling nauseous while eating, I took a pregnancy test and it came out positive. A doctor's visit confirmed I was 3 months pregnant, which meant the child was definitely my husband's, considering the timing of when I started attending the workshop. When I shared the news with my husband, he was overjoyed. He took me shopping for shoes and bags I had wanted, and even maternity clothes. Although it was still early, from the day he found out I was pregnant, he took over all the household chores, insisting I rest. Despite this, I continued to visit the workshop. Initially, I was just enjoying the dates, worried about possibly having a miscarriage again. As my pregnancy became more noticeable, the instructor started to find it odd. One day, They cautiously asked me if I was pregnant. I was so taken aback that I started crying. Without even understanding my own feelings, the instructor came over, hugged me, and comforted me. After a while, I told them, "This is as far as we go. We can't continue anymore." The instructor silently listened and then nodded in agreement. Honestly, I felt a mix of sadness and longing, so I hugged the instructor first. They accepted it silently. That was our last meeting, and we haven't seen each other since then. As I was leaving, the instructor said, "If you ever need me, for classes or otherwise, please come." I couldn't respond and just went home without looking back. Now, I'm in the final month of pregnancy and about to give birth. My husband is still treating me well, and I'm excited to finally become a mother. Our friends and family, hearing that we're having a child after 7 years of marriage, have been sending gifts and congratulations. I've been so happy that I barely remember the times when I was feeling down, but whenever I pass by the workshop, either with my husband or alone, a pang of longing hits me. It's not just once or twice that I've found myself circling the building, tempted to go in, only to head back home. I wonder what I'd even do if I went. Now that I'm in my final month of pregnancy and showing significantly, part of me doesn't want the instructor to see me like this. It feels like more than just the emotional fluctuations due to pregnancy hormones. Of course, I love my husband, who has been by my side, taking great care of me all this time, but my feelings for the instructor are a different kind of longing. Sometimes the workshop sends out texts about events and course information to its members, and I still receive these messages. Does that mean the instructor hasn't forgotten about me either?
My wife and I had been together for years, long enough for me to become accustomed to her various hobbies, even the more unusual ones. She had always had a fascination with things that most people might find a bit eccentric. Take her latest interest, Japanese rope art, or shibari. She spent hours reading about it, practicing knots, and even going to workshops. I wasn't into it, but I didn't interfere either. If it made her happy, so be it. My approach had always been practical. Everyone has their thing, and this was hers. I wasn't about to start tying myself up, but I also wasn't going to make a big deal out of it. One day, she came up with this idea of throwing a costume party. She was always one for themes and creativity, and this time it was going to be a school-themed party, like the high school get-togethers from our past. She was thrilled about it, running around the house, making notes, ordering decorations online. I have to say, the whole idea seemed a bit over the top for my taste. But, again, if this was what she wanted to do, I wasn't going to argue. She had that spark in her eye, the one she got when she was all in on a project. I figured, what's the harm? A bit of nostalgia never hurt anyone. She spent days planning, running errands, and trying to recreate the feel of those old teenage parties. I kept my distance from all the preparations, to be honest. It wasn't really my thing, never had been. But when she asked if I could help by picking up some supplies, I figured it was the least I could do. She handed me a list that felt longer than my arm, and I headed out to get the stuff. On my way out, I could hear her on the phone, chatting with someone, probably about the guest list. She was always the social one, making sure everything was just right for her friends. The store was a mess. It felt like everyone in town had decided to do their shopping that day, and I had to push my way through the aisles just to grab what we needed. Drinks, snacks, decorations, you name it. I loaded up the cart and tried not to think too hard about the expense. It wasn't like we threw parties every weekend, so I let it slide. Besides, she'd been working hard on this, and I wanted her to enjoy it. I may not have understood all her hobbies, but I knew how much it meant to her to put something like this together. It took me longer than I expected to get everything, mostly because of the crowds. By the time I got to the checkout, I was already tired of the whole idea. I just wanted to get home, unload everything, and maybe relax with a beer before the chaos began. I wasn't much for parties, especially not the kind where everyone dresses up and pretends they're teenagers again. But I'd promised her I'd be supportive, so I kept my thoughts to myself and focused on getting through the checkout line without losing my patience. On the way back, I couldn't help but think about how different we were in some ways. She loved the excitement, the creativity, the chance to do something out of the ordinary. I was more straightforward, more interested in keeping things simple and predictable. But I suppose that was part of what made us work as a couple. She brought the energy, and I brought the stability. At least, that's how I like to think of it. As long as she wasn't asking me to do anything too ridiculous, I was fine with letting her have her fun. When I finally got back home, I could already see the decorations from the driveway. She'd gone all out, streamers, lights, even a big banner across the porch. It looked like something out of a high school movie. I sighed, not out of annoyance, but more out of acceptance. This was going to be one of those nights. The kind where I just had to go along for the ride and hope it didn't get too crazy. I carried the bags inside, and she came rushing over, her face lighting up when she saw all the stuff I'd managed to get. She was excited, and I couldn't help but smile a bit. At least one of us was looking forward to this. The house was a whirlwind of activity. She was putting up the last of the decorations, making sure everything was perfect. I put the bags down and watched for a moment. It was her element, she was in control, making things happen, and I was just there to support her. And that was fine by me. As long as she was happy, I could put up with a little bit of chaos. The day of the party came, but it wasn't quite what I expected. For some reason, the timing had changed. I thought it was supposed to be next weekend, but my wife had other plans. She'd rearranged everything, and before I knew it, our house was filled with people. Not just the friends and familiar faces I'd expected either, there were strangers everywhere. I didn't recognize half the people in our living room, and it made me uneasy. I stood there for a moment, scanning the crowd, wondering where all these new faces had come from and why nobody had bothered to tell me. The whole place had been transformed. Red plastic cups littered every surface, music blasted from the speakers, and there was a game of beer pong set up in the kitchen. It looked like a scene straight out of a college party, not something you'd expect from a bunch of grown adults. I couldn't help but shake my head at the sight. It wasn't really my idea of a good time, but I wasn't about to ruin it for my wife. She seemed to be having a great time, running around, making sure everyone had drinks, laughing with her friends. I tried to make the best of it, grabbed a beer, and found a spot to stand where I could keep an eye on things. I wasn't much of a social butterfly, and I certainly wasn't going to get involved in the beer pong or whatever else they had going on. I preferred to stay on the sidelines, watching, making sure everything was under control. But it was hard to ignore the chaos. People were getting louder, and it seemed like everyone was trying to outdo each other in terms of how drunk they could get. It was starting to get out of hand. At some point, I noticed a group of people getting particularly rowdy. They were gathered in the corner of the living room, shouting at each other, and it didn't look like friendly banter. One guy, I didn't know who he was swaying on his feet, his face flushed, and his voice getting louder with every word. Another guy, who I recognized as one of my wife's friends, was right in his face, clearly not backing down. It was obvious to me that this was about to turn into something more than just a heated argument. I put my beer down and made my way over to them. I wasn't about to let a fight break out in my house. Hey, let's calm it down, I said, stepping between them. I kept my voice firm but not aggressive. The last thing I wanted was to escalate things further. I put a hand on each of their shoulders, trying to separate them. The drunk guy stumbled back a bit, and I used the opportunity to get my wife's friend to step away. Take it easy, it's just a party, I said, trying to defuse the situation. My wife must have noticed what was happening because she came over just as I was trying to get things under control. She took the drunk guy by the arm and led him away, saying something to him that I couldn't quite hear over the music. She had a way of handling these kinds of situations, calm, collected, always knowing the right thing to say. I was glad she was there to help. I wasn't interested in playing babysitter all night, but I also wasn't going to let things spiral out of control. Eventually, the tension started to ease. The guy my wife had taken aside seemed to calm down, and she led him out to the backyard, away from the rest of the crowd. The music was still loud, people were still drinking, but at least the threat of a fight had passed. I went back to my spot by the wall, picking up my beer again and taking a long drink. This was exactly why I wasn't a fan of these kinds of parties: too many people, too much chaos, and too many chances for something to go wrong. After the party, I started noticing a change in my wife's behavior. She seemed glued to her phone more than usual, always texting or scrolling. It wasn't like her to be so absorbed in it, especially when we were supposed to be spending time together. I'd ask her something, and she'd take a moment before looking up, as if she hadn't heard me the first time. I wasn't the type to snoop or question every little thing, but it was hard not to notice how often her attention was somewhere else. One evening, I asked her who she was always talking to. She looked up from her phone, almost startled, like she hadn't realized I was watching. She smiled and said it was just a new friend she had met recently. Apparently, this friend was also into shibari, and they'd hit it off at one of the workshops. She told me the woman's name, and something about how they were sharing ideas and techniques. I nodded, not really interested in the details, but I could tell that it meant a lot to her. She mentioned that this friend was really passionate about the art and that they had been exchanging messages about different styles, knots, and events. To me, it sounded like more of the same, another hobbyist my wife had connected with. I wasn't particularly thrilled about it, but I didn't see any harm either. If it kept her happy and occupied, then who was I to argue? Everyone needed something to be passionate about, and for her, this was it. There were times when her phone would buzz late at night, and she'd pick it up immediately, her face lighting up as she read whatever message had come through. I couldn't help but feel a bit annoyed sometimes. It felt like this friend was getting more of her attention than I was. But I wasn't about to turn it into a big deal. I trusted my wife, and if she said it was just a friend, then that was that. I wasn't the kind of guy to pry or make accusations without reason. Still, it was hard to ignore completely. We'd be sitting on the couch, watching TV, and she'd be typing away, her eyes on the screen more than on the show we were supposed to be watching together. I'd make a comment about something happening on the show, and she'd just nod absent-mindedly, barely paying attention. It wasn't exactly the kind of quality time I had in mind, but I kept my mouth shut. I wasn't interested in starting an argument over something that seemed harmless. She even mentioned meeting up with this friend a couple of times, saying they were planning to practice together. I remember raising an eyebrow at that, but she just laughed it off, saying it was nothing serious, just two people sharing a common interest. I let it go. My wife had always been social, always liked meeting new people and learning from them. It was one of the things I admired about her, even if I didn't always understand it. I figured this was just another one of those times. It didn't take long for things to start feeling different around the house. My wife had started going out more often, and not just for a quick errand or a coffee with friends. She'd be gone for hours, usually in the evenings, and she'd come back late at night. The first time, I didn't think much of it. She said she was meeting up with her friend, the same one she'd been messaging all the time. She said they were practicing, and I just nodded, figuring it was part of her hobby. The second time, though, it started to feel a bit strange. She left again in the evening, dressed a little nicer than usual, and didn't come back until well past midnight. When she got home, she was upbeat, almost too cheerful. I asked her where she'd been, and she gave me the same story, practicing with her friend. I could tell she was trying to make it sound casual, but something about it didn't sit right with me. Still, I wasn't going to jump to conclusions. I didn't want to be the kind of husband who questioned every little thing. She'd come in, give me a kiss on the cheek, and tell me about how they'd tried some new techniques. I didn't really follow the details, but I nodded along, trying to show I was listening. It felt like her mind was always somewhere else, even when she was sitting right next to me. I asked her if everything was all right, and she laughed it off, saying I was just imagining things. I decided not to push it further. She mentioned meeting up with this friend more often, saying they were planning to practice together. I remember raising an eyebrow at that, but she just laughed it off, saying it was nothing serious, just two people sharing a common interest. I let it go. She'd always been social, always liked meeting new people, and I figured this was just another one of those times. One evening, she left without much explanation, dressed up more than I expected for a simple hobby session. I watched her leave, feeling a mix of confusion and unease. It wasn't like her to be so secretive, but I convinced myself that it was all in my head. She'd always been open with me, and I had no reason to doubt her now. That night, after she got back, we went to bed like we always did. She curled up next to me, her head on my shoulder, and I wrapped my arm around her. She was asleep in minutes, her breathing slow and steady, but I lay there, wide awake. I couldn't help but wonder what was really going on. I wanted to trust her, to believe that everything was as simple as she made it seem, but the doubts were there, no matter how hard I tried to push them away. That night, I couldn't sleep. My wife had gone to bed easily, her breathing steady, while I lay there, wide awake, staring at the ceiling. Something wasn't sitting right with me. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more going on than she was letting on. I tried to ignore it, to push the thoughts away, but the more I tried, the stronger the urge became. Eventually, I gave in. Quietly, I reached over to her side of the bed and picked up her phone. I knew it was a line I shouldn't cross, but I couldn't help myself. Unlocking her phone, I started scrolling through her messages. Most of them were the usual, family group chats, messages from friends. But then I found a conversation that stood out. It was with a man whose name I recognized from the party. I remembered seeing him that night, one of the strangers who had shown up and caused trouble. The messages were casual enough at first, but as I read further, it was clear that this was more than just a friendly chat. The way they talked, the things they said to each other, it wasn't right. My heart pounded as I read through the thread, a mix of anger and disbelief building inside me. I put the phone back, careful not to wake her, and lay there, staring at the ceiling once again. This time, though, my mind was racing. There was no denying it now. She was lying to me. The friend she'd been meeting, the one she'd been messaging constantly, it wasn't some innocent acquaintance. It was him. The guy from the party. The one I had already had a bad feeling about. I clenched my jaw, trying to keep my emotions in check. I knew I couldn't let this slide. Something had to be done. The next morning, I confronted her. She was in the kitchen, making coffee, when I walked in. I didn't waste time with pleasantries. I told her I had seen her messages, that I knew she had been talking to that guy. She looked at me, her eyes widening in shock. For a moment, she didn't say anything, and then her expression shifted. She was angry. "You had no right to go through my phone," she snapped, her voice rising. I could feel my own anger bubbling up, but I kept my voice steady. I told her that it didn't matter, what mattered was that she had lied to me, that she was talking to someone she shouldn't be. She tried to defend herself, saying it was nothing, that I was overreacting. But I wasn't having it. I told her, plain and simple, that I wanted her to cut off all contact with him. No more messages, no more meetups, nothing. She glared at me, her face flushed with anger, but she didn't argue. She just turned away, muttering under her breath. I knew she was furious, but I didn't care. I wasn't about to let some guy come between us, to let her lie to me and think it was okay. After she left the room, I picked up my phone and found the guy's number. I didn't hesitate. I called him, and when he answered, I didn't bother with introductions. I told him exactly who I was and what I thought of him. I made it clear that if he ever came near my wife again, there would be consequences. Physical consequences. I wasn't interested in hearing his excuses or explanations. I just wanted him to know that I wasn't playing games. He tried to say something, but I cut him off and ended the call. I wasn't going to waste any more time on him. When my wife found out that I had called him, she was livid. She said I had gone too far, that I had no right to threaten him like that. I could see the hurt in her eyes, but I stood my ground. I told her that I did what I had to do, that I wasn't going to let her make a fool out of me. She stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind her. I could hear her crying in the other room, but I didn't follow her. I wasn't going to apologize for protecting what was mine. For the next few days, things were tense between us. She barely spoke to me, and when she did, it was short and clipped. But I noticed that she wasn't messaging him anymore. She had deleted the conversation, and whenever her phone buzzed, it wasn't him. She made a point of showing me that she was done with him, that she was cutting ties. I could tell she was still angry, still hurt by what I had done, but at least she was making an effort. And that was enough for now. Work had been hell all week. Problems kept piling up, and I found myself staying late every night, trying to sort things out. Deadlines, paperwork, endless meetings, it was all wearing me down. I hadn't had time to think about much else, let alone focus on what was happening at home. My wife and I were still on shaky ground after what had happened with the messages, but I had hoped that with a little time, things might settle down. I was too exhausted to argue, too tired to think about anything beyond the next day. On one of those nights, I managed to get out of the office earlier than usual. It felt like a small victory, and all I wanted to do was get home, take a shower, and maybe have a quiet dinner. I drove back, the traffic lighter than I expected, and pulled into the driveway. The house was dark, which struck me as odd. Usually, there'd be lights on, the TV flickering in the living room, some sign of life. I shrugged it off, figuring maybe she was out or just in bed early. I unlocked the door and stepped inside, the quietness of the house unsettling. As I walked down the hallway, I heard something, a noise coming from the back room, the one we hardly used. It was faint, almost like muffled voices or movement. My first thought was that she was watching something on her phone, but something about it didn't feel right. The door was slightly ajar, and I could see a dim light coming through the crack. My gut twisted. I pushed the door open, not knowing what I was about to find, but nothing could have prepared me for what I saw. There she was, my wife, tied up, hanging upside down, completely naked. And right next to her, just as naked, was that bastard. The one I had warned her about. The one I had told her to stay away from. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze. My mind went blank, my vision narrowing on the two of them. I could feel the blood pounding in my ears, my heart hammering in my chest. I didn't even think. I just moved, driven by pure rage, by the betrayal that was right in front of me. I lunged at him, grabbing him by the arm and yanking him away from her. He barely had time to react before my fist connected with his face. He stumbled back, crashing into the wall, and I didn't stop. I hit him again, the rage pouring out of me with every punch. He tried to shield himself, tried to say something, but I didn't care. I wasn't listening. All I could see was red. The thought of him in my house, with my wife, doing this, it was more than I could handle. I wanted to make him pay, to make him regret ever setting foot in my home. He tried to fight back, but he was no match for me. I had years of anger, years of frustration built up, and it all came out in that moment. I could hear my wife screaming, telling me to stop, but her voice was distant, barely registering in my mind. I grabbed him by the neck, dragging him towards the door, my hand shaking with the force of my anger. He was bleeding, his face bruised, but I didn't care. He deserved every bit of it. He had no right to be here, no right to touch her, no right to invade my life like this. I dragged him through the hallway, his feet stumbling over themselves as he tried to keep up. He was pleading now, his voice cracking, but I wasn't listening. I was done with him. I wanted him out of my house, out of my life. I reached the front door, yanking it open, and shoved him outside. He stumbled, nearly falling, and I stood there, my chest heaving, my fist still clenched. "If I ever see you again, I growled, my voice low and filled with venom. I swear to God, I'll kill you. He didn't say anything. He just turned and ran, his bare feet slapping against the pavement as he disappeared into the night. I stood there for a moment, watching him go, my hand still trembling. I slammed the door shut, the sound echoing through the empty house. I turned back, my eyes falling on the mess that was left behind. My wife was still there, still tied up, her eyes wide with fear. But I didn't care. Not right then. All I cared about was getting that bastard out of my house. And I had done that. I had thrown him out, and he wasn't coming back. She was still there, hanging upside down, her eyes wide with shock and fear. She started screaming at me, her voice frantic, but I didn't hear a word she said. All I could think about was how she had betrayed me, how she had lied to my face over and over again. I walked past her, ignoring her cries, and headed straight to the bedroom. I grabbed a suitcase from the closet and started throwing her clothes into it, my hands moving quickly, mechanically. I wasn't thinking about what I was doing, I just wanted her gone. The more I packed, the louder her screams became. She was yelling at me, calling my name, begging me to untie her, to talk to her. But I wasn't interested in talking. There was nothing left to say. I had seen everything I needed to see. I had given her a chance, and she had thrown it away. I zipped up the suitcase, my movement sharp and angry, and carried it back to where she was still hanging. She looked at me, her face streaked with tears, her voice breaking as she pleaded with me. But I had no sympathy left. I dropped the suitcase at her feet, my expression cold, and reached up to untie her. She fell to the floor, landing in a heap, and I stepped back, watching as she struggled to get up. She looked at me, her eyes searching mine for some sign of forgiveness, some sign that I might change my mind. But there was nothing there. I was done. I pointed to the suitcase, my voice flat as I told her to take her things and leave. She hesitated for a moment, her eyes widening in disbelief, but then she realized I wasn't joking. She tried to argue, tried to tell me that it wasn't what it looked like, that she could explain. But I wasn't interested in her explanations. I had heard enough lies, seen enough betrayal. I told her again, more forcefully this time, to take her things and get out. She looked at me, her face crumpling, and then she reached for the suitcase, her hands trembling. She stood up, her legs unsteady, and started to walk towards the door. I followed her, my eyes never leaving her, making sure she understood that this was final. She stopped at the door, turning to look at me one last time, her eyes filled with tears. She tried to say something, her voice barely a whisper, but I cut her off. I told her that I was filing for divorce, that I was done with her, that there was no coming back from this. She looked at me, her face pale, and then she turned and walked out, the door closing behind her with a hollow thud. I stood there for a moment, staring at the closed door, my chest tight, but I didn't feel any regret. Just a cold, empty sense of finality. Once she was gone, I turned and walked back through the house, taking in the mess that was left behind. The rope, the overturned furniture, the shattered pieces of what was once our life together. I felt a strange sense of calm as I began to clean up, my movement slow and deliberate. I picked up the rope, coiling it neatly, and put it away. I righted the furniture, wiped down the surfaces. It was like I was erasing her presence from the house, taking back what was mine. It felt right. It felt necessary. The next day, I went to see a lawyer. I told him I wanted a divorce, that I wanted it done quickly, cleanly, with no chance of reconciliation. He nodded, taking notes, asking questions, but I barely heard him. My mind was elsewhere, already moving forward, already trying to figure out what my life would look like without her. I knew it wouldn't be easy. There would be questions, there would be judgment, but I didn't care. I was ready to be done with it all, ready to move on. By the time I got home, the house was quiet, empty. I sat down on the couch, staring at the wall, the silence settling around me like a heavy blanket. It was over. The relationship, the lies, the betrayal, all of it was done. I didn't feel relief, not exactly. just a sense that it was time to start over, to put everything behind me and move forward. And that was exactly what I intended to do. After the divorce, I felt like I needed something to clear the air, something to mark a new beginning. The house had been too quiet for too long, filled with the echoes of what had happened. I decided to throw a small party for a few close friends. Nothing big, just a gathering of people I trusted, people who had stuck by me during the worst of it. I wanted to put the past behind me, to fill the house with laughter and conversation again, to remind myself that life could still be good. I spent the day getting things ready. It wasn't anything fancy, just some drinks, a few snacks, and some music. I wanted it to be simple, easy, something that wouldn't remind me of all the chaos that had come before. By the time my friends started arriving, I felt a sense of relief. The house felt alive again, the way it used to before everything had gone wrong. People were smiling, talking, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I could breathe. The evening was going well. We were all gathered in the living room, drinks in hand, the music playing softly in the background. There was a warmth in the air, a sense of normalcy that I had been craving. I was talking with one of my friends, laughing at some story he was telling, when I heard the knock at the door. I wasn't expecting anyone else, but I figured it was probably just a neighbor or someone who had heard the music and wanted to see what was going on. I excused myself and went to answer it. When I opened the door, my stomach dropped. Standing there was my ex-wife, and right beside her was that bastard, the one I had thrown out of my house, the one who had ruined everything. Behind them was a small group of people I didn't recognize. My ex looked at me, her expression almost defiant, like she had every right to be there. I could feel the tension rising in my chest, the anger bubbling up again. I didn't say anything for a moment, just stared at them, trying to keep my composure. I stepped aside, letting them in, but I could feel my hands clenching into fists at my sides. They walked into the living room, and the mood shifted instantly. My friends fell silent, their eyes darting between me and the newcomers. I could see the confusion, the discomfort, and I knew I had to do something. I wasn't about to let them ruin this night for me, not again. I walked over to where they were standing, my voice low but firm as I addressed my ex-wife and her lover. "You've got two options," I said, my eyes locked on them. "You either turn around and leave right now, or things are going to get real ugly, real fast." I could see the shock on her face, the way her lover shifted uncomfortably, glancing around at the people watching. I wasn't bluffing, and they could tell. I'd had enough of their games, enough of their disrespect. This was my home, my life, and I wasn't about to let them invade it again. My ex started to say something, her voice shaking, but I cut her off. "I'm serious," I said, my voice cold. "You need to leave. Now." I could feel the room holding its breath, everyone waiting to see what would happen. Her lover looked at me, his eyes narrowing, like he was trying to decide if I was serious. I reached behind me, my hand resting on the drawer where I kept the gun. I didn't want to use it, but I was ready to if I had to. I wasn't going to let them take anything else from me. The tension in the room was thick, the silence almost unbearable. I had given them an ultimatum, but it seemed like they were still deciding whether to take me seriously. My ex-wife's lover stood there, his eyes locked on mine, and I could see the challenge in his gaze. He wasn't backing down, and it infuriated me. I didn't want trouble, but I also wasn't going to let them ruin what I was trying to build here. The weight of the situation pressed on me, and I could feel the muscles in my jaw tightening. One of his friends, a big guy, bigger than me by a good margin, took a step forward. He was trying to be intimidating, trying to show that they weren't afraid of my threat. My heart started pounding, my pulse quickening as I watched him move closer. He took another step, and I could feel the air shift, the room holding its breath. My hand was still resting on the drawer where I kept the gun, and I could feel the cold metal just beneath my fingers. I wasn't a man who made empty threats. I had meant every word I said. I warned him to stop, my voice low and steady, but he didn't listen. He kept moving towards me, his posture aggressive, his eyes fixed on mine. I could hear my friends behind me, their nervous murmurs filling the silence, but I couldn't focus on them. All I could see was this man, this threat, coming at me. He took another step, and that was it. My instincts kicked in, the years of anger and betrayal boiling over in an instant. I pulled the gun from the drawer, my hand shaking just slightly, and pointed it at him. "Back off," I said, my voice coming out as more of a growl. He hesitated for a second, but then he took another step, and I knew he wasn't going to stop. I squeezed the trigger, the shot echoing through the room, louder than I had expected. Time seemed to slow down as I watched him stumble back, his hands flying to his stomach, his face contorting in pain. He fell to the floor, the others in the room frozen in shock. The music had stopped, the laughter and conversation replaced by stunned silence. My ex-wife screamed, her voice piercing through the quiet, and the rest of her group panicked. Her lover looked at me, his eyes wide with fear, and without another word, he turned and ran. The others followed, scrambling for the door, their footsteps pounding against the floor as they fled. I stood there, the gun still in my hand, my heart racing. I could hear the ragged breathing of the man on the floor, his moans of pain cutting through the stillness. I knew I had to act quickly. I put the gun down on the table, my hand shaking as I pulled out my phone. I dialed 911, my voice steady as I told the operator what had happened. I gave them my address, explained that there had been a shooting, that someone was injured. The words felt strange coming out of my mouth, like I was talking about something that had happened to someone else. But this was real. This was happening, and there was no going back now. I looked down at the man on the floor, his hands still pressed against his stomach, blood seeping through his fingers. My friends were standing off to the side, their faces pale, their eyes wide with shock. I could see the fear in their eyes, the confusion, the questions they were too afraid to ask. I didn't say anything to them. There was nothing to say. I had done what I had to do to protect myself, to protect my home. And now, all I could do was wait for the police to arrive. The minutes felt like hours as we waited, the tension in the room unbearable. The sound of sirens in the distance was both a relief and a reminder of what had just happened. The door was still open, the cool night air drifting in, and I stood there, staring at the scene in front of me, trying to make sense of it all. I had crossed a line, one I knew I could never uncross. But I had done it to protect myself, to defend what was mine. And now, I would have to face the consequences. The trial was one of the most grueling experiences of my life. I sat there in the courtroom, surrounded by strangers, the judge, the jury, the lawyers, all of them watching me, trying to decide whether I was a criminal or just a man pushed to his limits. My lawyer argued that it was self-defense, that I had been protecting my home, my friends, and myself. The prosecutor tried to paint me as a violent man, someone who had taken things too far. It was hard to sit there, listening to them talk about me like they knew who I was, like they understood what had happened that night. The witnesses were called, my friends taking the stand one by one. They spoke about how the man had come at me, how he had ignored my warnings, how I had done everything I could to avoid violence until there was no other choice. Their words were a lifeline, a reminder that I wasn't alone in this, that people had seen what had really happened. The prosecutor tried to twist their words, to make it seem like I had been looking for a fight, but my friends held their ground. They told the truth, and I could see the doubt in the jurors' eyes beginning to fade. My ex-wife was there too, sitting on the other side of the courtroom. She looked different, worn down, tired. She didn't testify, didn't say a word to me the entire time. I could see the anger in her eyes, but also something else, maybe regret, maybe fear. I wasn't sure, and honestly, I didn't care. She had made her choices, and now we were both paying the price for them. I kept my focus on the trial, on the facts, on what I had to do to get through this. When the jury finally delivered their verdict, it felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. They found me not guilty, agreeing that my actions had been in self-defense. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding, the weight of the past few weeks suddenly lifting off my shoulders. The judge spoke, the gavel came down, and just like that, it was over. I was free. But it didn't feel like a victory, just an end to a nightmare I had never wanted to be part of in the first place. After the trial, I went home, the house feeling emptier than ever. The silence was almost deafening, but it was a relief too. No more chaos, no more uncertainty, just peace. I spent the next few days trying to get back to some kind of normal, trying to figure out what my life was supposed to look like now. It wasn't easy, but I knew I had to keep moving forward. I had been given a second chance, and I wasn't going to waste it. A few weeks later, I heard through a mutual acquaintance that my ex-wife's lover had left her. Apparently, after everything that had happened, he had decided that it wasn't worth it. He had walked out, leaving her to deal with the aftermath on her own. I wasn't surprised. He had always struck me as the kind of guy who ran when things got tough, and this was no different. I felt a strange mix of emotions when I heard the news: anger, pity, maybe even a little satisfaction. She had made her choices, and now she was dealing with the consequences. I didn't reach out to her. There was nothing left to say. She had made her bed, and now she was lying in it. I had my own life to focus on, my own future to build. I wasn't interested in what she was going through, in whether she was happy or miserable. That part of my life was over, and I was ready to leave it behind. I had spent too long caught up in the drama, in the lies and betrayal. It was time to move on. In the end, the trial, the shooting, the betrayal, it all felt like a bad dream, something that had happened to someone else. I knew I would carry the scars of it all for the rest of my life, but I also knew that I had come out the other side stronger. I had faced my worst fears, had stood my ground, and had survived. And now, finally, I was ready to start over, to build a life that was mine, free from the shadows of the past. It wasn't long after the trial that my ex-wife started reaching out to me again. At first, it was subtle, a text message here, a call there. She would say she just wanted to check in, to see how I was doing, but I could read between the lines. She was looking for a way back in. I ignored her messages, letting my phone ring until it went to voicemail. There was nothing she could say that would change what had happened, nothing that would make me want to let her back into my life. Eventually, she started coming by the house. She would knock on the door, sometimes for minutes at a time, calling my name, asking me to just talk to her. I never answered. I would stand there, just out of sight, listening to her plead, her voice cracking as she begged me to give her another chance. But I couldn't do it. The betrayal was too deep, the scars too fresh. I had given her everything, and she had thrown it away. There was no going back from that. One day, she left a letter in my mailbox. It was long, pages and pages of apologies, of explanations, of promises that she would change, that things would be different if I just gave her one more chance. I read it once, then folded it back up and put it away. Her words didn't move me. They felt empty, like she was trying to rewrite the past, to make it seem like everything could be fixed with a few apologies. But I knew better. Some things couldn't be undone, and some wounds couldn't be healed. Around that time, I met someone new. Her name was Emily. We met through a friend at a small gathering, nothing like the chaotic parties of the past. She was different, calm, kind, with a warmth that I hadn't realized I needed. We started talking, and there was an ease to it, a simplicity that felt right. There were no games, no lies, just two people getting to know each other. I found myself looking forward to our conversations, to the time we spent together. It was like a breath of fresh air, a reminder that there was still good in the world. Emily knew about my past. I didn't hide it from her. I told her about the divorce, about the betrayal, about the trial. She listened without judgment, her eyes soft, her hand resting on mine as I spoke. She didn't try to offer solutions or tell me what I should have done differently. She just listened, and that was enough. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I could let my guard down, like I didn't have to be on edge all the time. It was a feeling I hadn't realized I missed. My ex-wife kept trying to reach out, but I ignored her. I was done with that chapter of my life. I had spent too long caught up in the drama, in the lies and betrayal. I wasn't going to let her pull me back into that darkness. I had found something better, something real, and I wasn't about to let it slip away. Emily was a chance at a new beginning, a chance to build something healthy, something that wasn't tainted by the past. One day, my ex showed up at the house again. She stood on the porch, her eyes red from crying, and begged me to talk to her. I looked at her through the window, her figure blurred by the glass, and I felt nothing. No anger, no sadness, no desire to open the door. I turned away, walked back to where Emily was waiting in the kitchen, and wrapped my arms around her. My ex-wife's voice faded into the background, and all I could hear was Emily's laughter, soft and genuine. Moving on wasn't easy, and I knew there would always be scars. But I also knew that I deserved better, that I deserved happiness, peace, and someone who would stand by me without lies or betrayal. With Emily, I felt like I had a chance at that. A chance to start over, to leave the past behind, and to open a new chapter in my life. And that was exactly what I intended to do. It happened one morning as I was getting ready to head out. I walked up to my car, and there it was, a long, jagged scratch running along the side. It wasn't something small either, someone had put some real effort into it, making sure it couldn't be ignored. My heart sank at the sight of it, the anger bubbling up almost immediately. I knew, deep down, who was behind this. It had to be her. My ex-wife, the only person who had that kind of spite left in her. I decided to check the security cameras just to be sure. Later that day, I sat down and pulled up the footage from the cameras I had installed around the house. As I scrolled through the recordings, there she was. In the dead of night, she had crept up to my car, her face partially hidden, and taken something sharp to the paint. I watched, my jaw tightening as she scratched her way from one end of the car to the other, her movements almost methodical. It was clear that this wasn't just a random act, it was personal, a message to me that she wasn't done yet. I could feel my hand shaking with anger as I watched the footage. I could have called the police right then, reported the vandalism, and let them handle it. But as I sat there, watching her on the screen, I realized I wanted more than just a report. I wanted her to face the consequences of her actions, and I wanted her to know that I wasn't playing games anymore. I talked it over with Emily that evening, and she agreed. We would set her up, make her think she was getting what she wanted, and let her fall right into the trap she had set for herself. I picked up my phone and called my ex-wife. She answered almost immediately, her voice cautious at first, then hopeful as I told her I wanted to talk. I told her I had been thinking about things, that maybe we had been too hasty, that maybe there was still something worth saving between us. I could hear the excitement in her voice as she agreed to come over. She didn't even hesitate. She said she'd be there that evening, and I knew I had her exactly where I wanted her. When she arrived, I let her in, putting on my best act. I told her that Emily was out of the picture, that I had realized she was the one I wanted to be with. She ate it up, her eyes brightening, her smile widening as she stepped closer to me. I could see the desperation in her eyes, the need to believe that she was getting what she wanted. I played along, keeping my distance just enough to make it seem real, but not enough for her to get too comfortable. I wanted her to think she had won. Then came the knock at the door. I watched her face fall, confusion replacing the hope that had been there just moments before. I walked over and opened the door, letting the officers in. My ex-wife's expression shifted from confusion to panic as she saw them. She turned to me, her eyes wide, her voice trembling as she asked what was going on. I didn't say anything at first, I just picked up the remote and played the footage from the cameras, the screen showing her, clear as day, vandalizing my car. Her face went pale, and she started to protest, but the officers were already moving towards her. She screamed at me as they put her in handcuffs, calling me every name in the book, her voice filled with hatred and betrayal. She accused me of setting her up, of being a liar, of being a coward. I stood there, watching as they led her out of the house, her shouts fading as they took her away. I felt a strange sense of satisfaction, a weight lifting off my shoulders. She had pushed too far, and now she was finally facing the consequences. It wasn't about revenge, it was about protecting myself, about making sure she understood that I wasn't someone she could walk all over. In the weeks that followed, she ended up paying for the damage to my car, the legal consequences enough to keep her away from me for good. Emily and I decided it was time for a fresh start, away from the memories, away from the drama that had haunted this house for too long. We found a new place, something smaller, something that felt like ours and not a reminder of everything that had happened. Moving in felt like closing a door on the past, like finally being free of the weight that had been holding me down for so long. As we settled into our new home, I felt a sense of peace that I hadn't felt in years. The past was behind us, the chaos and pain left in the rearview mirror. Emily and I were building something new, something that was ours alone. And as I looked at her, smiling as she unpacked a box in the kitchen, I knew that I had made the right choice. It was time to move forward, to leave behind the anger, the betrayal, and to embrace the life that lay ahead of us.
Brian Welker's story didn't begin with his recent promotion or the tension in his marriage. Years earlier, he had been at the center of an unexpected crisis when Harding Containers faced a significant environmental compliance issue. The company had been cited for improperly managing waste materials, and layoffs loomed as regulators pressed for expensive upgrades. Brian, known for his attention to detail, uncovered a crucial mistake in the paperwork submitted by a third-party contractor. His discovery saved the company from heavier fines and earned him an unsought reputation as a problem solver among the management team. This wasn't Brian's first brush with high stakes. A few years before Tim was born, Brian had been in a serious car accident while driving back from a friend's bachelor party. A drunk driver had veered into his lane, causing a collision that left Brian with a fractured arm and lingering anxiety about night driving. Though he recovered physically, the experience instilled in him a deep sense of caution and responsibility, traits that later defined his approach to fatherhood and work. In the early days of his marriage to Brenda, they had faced an unexpected hurdle when a tornado tore through their neighborhood, leaving their small apartment heavily damaged. For weeks, they lived in a motel while sorting through insurance claims and salvaging what they could from the wreckage. The ordeal brought them closer, as they relied on each other to rebuild their lives. At the time, Brian felt confident they could overcome anything together. When Tim was a toddler, Brian's younger brother, Charlie, had struggled with dependence and briefly moved in with the family. Brian took on the role of mediator, balancing his brother's needs with the well-being of his wife and child. Though Charlie eventually sought treatment and turned his life around, the strain it placed on their household left an indelible mark. Brenda, in particular, resented the intrusion and often brought up how much the situation had disrupted their lives. One of Brian's proudest achievements came during Tim's elementary school years when he designed and built a custom playground for the school as part of a community service project. Using his skills as a machinist, Brian volunteered countless hours fabricating equipment and overseeing its installation. The playground became a beloved fixture in the neighborhood, and Tim often boasted to his friends about his dad's handiwork. Despite his dedication to family and community, Brian had a quiet passion that few people knew about: restoring vintage motorcycles. Tucked away in the garage was a partially restored 1972 Triumph Bonneville, a project he worked on sporadically during his rare moments of downtime. He often dreamed of finishing the bike and taking long, solitary rides through the countryside, a goal that seemed increasingly out of reach as the demands of life continued to pile up. Brian Welker wiped the sweat from his brow, a faint smile creeping onto his face. Earlier that day, he'd been promoted to shift supervisor at Harding Containers, a milestone he'd been striving toward for years. The position came with added responsibilities, but working the night shift was a perfect fit. It meant he could attend his son Tim's school events and games during the day without compromising work. Having worked nights before, Brian knew he could manage the adjustment. With a few paid days off before starting his new role, Brian decided it was time to tackle a project he'd been putting off for ages: converting the space above his detached garage into a livable apartment. His vision was simple: a quiet haven where he could sleep during the day without disturbances. But before he could get started, there was an issue to solve. The Wi-Fi signal didn't reach the garage. Determined to fix it, he climbed into the attic to run a cable and strengthen the connection. As he carefully fed the cable through the crawl space, a faint noise caught his attention. The house was supposed to be empty. Brenda was at work, and Tim was spending the day with his grandparents. But the sound was unmistakable, coming from the bedroom. Brian froze, his pulse quickening, and crawled toward the source, moving as quietly as possible. Through an old, unsealed vent in the attic, Brian caught sight of something that shattered his world. Brenda was in their bed with another man. Stunned, he stared in silence, his heart pounding as he tried to process what he was seeing. Shaking with rage and disbelief, he reached for his phone and began recording the betrayal, ensuring he captured both their actions and words. "I like this arrangement," the man said smugly. "Your husband doesn't even touch you." "Don't bring Brian into this," Brenda responded, her voice strained with guilt. The man, Bill Grant, a delivery driver Brenda worked with and the divorced father of one of Tim's classmates, grinned. "We're literally in his bed, Brenda. What does that say about us?" Brenda sighed, uneasy. "I don't know why I let you convince me to do this. We could have gone to your place. It would have been safer." "But where's the fun in that?" Grant replied, laughing. "The risk, the thrill, it's what makes it worth it." Brian's grip tightened on his phone as he watched the scene unfold. The man's arrogance, Brenda's betrayal, the casual mockery of his trust, it was unbearable. Yet he stayed silent, forcing himself to remain calm. He had all the proof he needed. Once the house fell quiet, Brian climbed down from the attic, his mind swirling with anger, sadness, and disbelief. Brenda hadn't just been unfaithful. She'd systematically disrespected him, shutting him out of their marriage while sneaking around with another man. It wasn't just an affair, it was a deliberate rejection. Later, standing under a hot shower, Brian allowed himself to confront the truth. His marriage was over. Brenda's betrayal had destroyed any love or trust he once had for her, but he wasn't going to let her actions ruin him. His focus shifted to Tim, who still had 2 years of high school left. Brenda could live however she wanted. Brian no longer cared. The garage apartment, once imagined as a peaceful retreat, became the centerpiece of his plan to reclaim his independence. That evening, he reached out to contractors to discuss turning the space into a fully functional living area, complete with a kitchenette and bathroom. With his new promotion, he could afford to outsource the work and save himself the time and stress. For the first time, Brian realized the true value of his time. Pinching pennies for the future no longer mattered, especially since half of everything he had might eventually go to Brenda. From now on, his priorities were himself and Tim. By the time Tim left for college, Brian intended to have a solid plan for his next chapter, one where he wouldn't tolerate being disrespected ever again. When Brenda came home that evening, Brian was seated calmly at the kitchen table. He studied her as she walked in. She looked different, older, and heavier than he remembered. How had he not noticed before? For a brief moment, sadness flickered through him, but he quickly reminded himself that her choices had brought them here. "You're home early," Brenda remarked, surprised. "Yeah," Brian replied coolly. "Something came up at work. I'm starting night shifts tonight, so I came back to rest before heading out." "They're making you work nights after a day shift?" she asked, feigning concern. "You should get some sleep." "That's the plan," he said evenly. "I'll wash the bedding," she offered quickly, likely recalling the state of their bed from earlier that day. "That's not necessary," Brian replied. "I'll sleep in the guest room." That evening, Brian left the house as if heading to work, but instead he drove to a nearby sports bar. There, he enjoyed a baseball game and a couple of beers, clearing his mind. When he returned home, Brenda was already asleep. Quietly, he parked in the garage and spent the night on an air mattress in the unfinished apartment, sleeping better than he had in weeks. The next morning, one of the contractors he'd contacted responded with a reasonable estimate and an immediate start date. The team could begin work on Monday and finish in just 2 weeks. Wasting no time, Brian signed the contract. As he envisioned the space taking shape, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. It was the first step toward building a new life, one free of betrayal, with a future he could finally control. On Sunday evening, Brian began his first shift as a supervisor. His schedule ran from Sunday to Thursday nights, with the plant closed on Friday and Saturday. Knowing this, Brenda was surprised the next night when Brian opted to sleep in the guest room. "Why are you sleeping in the guest room?" she asked. "We won't see much of each other while you're on the night shift. Why not sleep in our bed?" "I worked last night and got a few hours of sleep this morning," Brian explained. "I'm trying to adjust to staying up at night and sleeping during the day. I don't want to disturb your sleep." Brenda frowned slightly. "Unless you think we should, have sex?" Brian teased, raising an eyebrow. Her reaction was predictable. For a brief moment, she froze, then forced a faint smile. I'm really tired tonight, she said. Maybe we could just cuddle. Hugs don't help me, Brian said bluntly. If I hold you, I'll want more. If Zex is off the table, I'll avoid temptation and stay in the guest room. Don't bother making excuses. I'm not the type to force anything. I know, Brenda replied quickly. I'm just tired. I hope you understand. Oh, I understand perfectly, Brian said. Let me know when you're in the mood. If I feel the same, we'll see. Good night. With that, he walked to the guest room, leaving Brenda puzzled. On Saturday, Brian spent the day playing catch with Tim and doing yard work. That night, he returned to the guest room, further confusing Brenda. Sunday evening, Brian arrived early for his shift as supervisor. Confident in his ability to handle the role, he didn't bother telling Brenda about his promotion. She kept secrets from him, so he saw no reason to share his own. The shift went smoothly, and Brian quickly adapted to the new responsibilities. When he returned home Monday morning, Brenda was already at work, and the construction crew was busy renovating the apartment. After confirming plans with the foreman, Brian went inside to sleep, but was interrupted by the noise and a ringing landline in the guest room. Groggily, he answered. Hello? He muttered. Brian, sorry to wake you, his mother-in-law Beverly said. Is that why you called? Check if I was sleeping, Brian snapped. No need for attitude, she replied. Bill and I know you're on night shifts. Let us know if you need help with Tim. Brian hung up and unplugged the phone, muttering about people's cluelessness before drifting back to sleep. By Friday, the apartment renovations were complete, a feat that amazed Brian. The crew had finished in just 4 days, a task that would have taken him months. That afternoon, he purchased furniture, including a bed, a small kitchen table, a sofa, and appliances like a TV, refrigerator, oven, and microwave. As he admired the progress, Brian felt a renewed sense of control. The apartment marked the start of a new chapter, one where he prioritized himself and what truly mattered. By Monday afternoon, Brian was confident his new apartment would be ready for full-time use. He chuckled, recalling Brenda's confusion when she arrived home to find workers busy at the garage. Pulling him aside, she demanded to know what was going on. I'm having the apartment over the garage finished, Brian said. I need a quiet, insulated space to sleep during the day while working nights. No noise, no interruptions, and no landline. This way I won't disturb you or Tim, and you won't even notice I'm nearby. Brenda frowned. You're my husband and Tim's father. We should notice you're nearby. I'll take Tim to his practices and games, and we'll have family dinners. That's important. Brian smirked. I told you to let me know when you're in the mood for love, but you haven't taken me up on it. Brenda scowled. You're acting ridiculous. Marriage is about more than sex. It's about conversation and connection. Spare me the lecture, Brian shot back. I've done plenty for this marriage. Just let me know when you're ready to be served. I'm not livestock, Brenda snapped. You'll apologize and take me out for a proper evening first, or forget it. Brian grinned and walked away, leaving Brenda both irritated and confused. Though she'd managed to stop Bill Grant from pushing her into more risky encounters, Brian's aloofness unsettled her. Once attentive, he now ignored her, which made her worry. Still, she believed he wouldn't go long without wanting her. She decided to wait for an apology, convinced his interest would return. By Wednesday, Brian had fully moved into his apartment. The upcoming Labor Day weekend gave him 3 days off, with Tim's school starting Tuesday. How about we go to the Diamondbacks game on Saturday? Brian asked over dinner. They're playing the Dodgers, and it's a big game for the pennant. That's awesome. Thanks, Dad, Tim exclaimed. I don't like baseball, Brenda grumbled. I'll stay home. I'm sure you'll find something to do, Brian said pointedly. It's settled. Tim and I are going. Can I tell Scooter? He'll be so jealous, Tim said. He's a Dodgers fan. Invite him, Brian suggested. It's more fun with friends. Thanks, Dad, Tim said, rushing off to call Scooter. You made Tim's day, Brenda said. Baseball's a good way to bond with boys. Scooter's polite. Wait, his real name's Horace? Brian laughed. Poor kid. His dad passed away 2 years ago, Brenda said, ignoring the comment. They moved here to be near family. I'll stick with Scooter, Brian replied as Tim returned, beaming. Scooter's mom said yes, he's coming with us, Tim said excitedly. Brian smiled. It's going to be a great game. On Saturday afternoon, Brian parked his truck in front of a tidy ranch-style house. Before the engine stopped, Scooter ran out and jumped into the truck next to Tim. Mr. Welker, my mom wants to meet you first, Scooter said with a grin. She probably wants to make sure you're not a serial killer. Sorry. "No problem," Brian replied, stepping out and ringing the doorbell. A slender woman around his age answered. Though plain-looking, her toned legs and jogging shorts caught his attention. "Let me guess. You think my legs are my best feature?" she said playfully. Brian hesitated, then laughed. "Well, they are impressive. Do you think I should let my son go to a baseball game with someone who stares at women?" she teased. "I'm trying to raise a gentleman." Brian decided to play along. "I'll teach him to appreciate the fairer sex, and to be subtle about it," he said with a grin. "Well, as long as he learns to respect women and defend himself from anyone calling him Horace, we're good," she said. "I'll make sure of it," Brian joked. "By the way, what do your friends call you?" "Gertrude. Unless you're one of my male friends, then it's Minx or Bubbles," she replied, laughing. "Minx it is," Brian said, smiling. "See you later, Minx." "Take care of my son," she said, still laughing. "He can go with you any time." The game was a success. Scooter caught a foul ball, and both boys overindulged in hot dogs and soda. On the way home, they fell asleep in the back of the truck. At Scooter's house, Brian walked the drowsy teen to the door, where Gertrude greeted them with a smile. "You might have had too many hot dogs and sodas," Brian admitted. "That's what baseball games are for," she replied warmly. "Thanks for taking care of him." "Scooter's a great kid, Minx. See you at the next game," Brian said, heading back to his truck. Brian quickly settled into a routine. He slept soundly in his newly insulated apartment from 9 a.m. to 3 p.m., thanks to thick curtains and soundproofing. Brenda occasionally complained about him staying in his man cave even on weekends, but she dropped the subject whenever he asked if she needed his services. Brian suspected her real concern was avoiding Grant and getting caught. Her reluctance to rock the boat suited Brian perfectly, as it kept their marriage intact until Tim graduated. Since Brian's new role as a foreman came with fewer physical responsibilities, he decided to purchase a home exercise machine marketed as providing a total body workout. Much to his delight, the machine delivered on its promise, as long as he stayed committed to using it regularly. Meanwhile, he made it a priority to attend all of Tim's baseball practices. Before long, the coach noticed Brian's involvement and started assigning him to work with some of the kids on the sidelines while the coach focused on the team as a whole. Tim was already a skilled player and continued improving steadily. But the biggest surprise was Scooter. At the start of the season, Scooter showed some potential but struggled with confidence and seemed hesitant. Determined to help, Brian spent as much time as he could with him, dedicating weekends to extra training sessions at the local park. Since Brian's relationship with his wife had grown distant, he figured channeling his energy into baseball was a productive way to manage stress. Over time, Scooter's confidence grew, and his performance on the field improved dramatically. By the middle of the season, Scooter was excelling as a shortstop and hitting consistently. Meanwhile, Tim solidified his role as the starting center fielder, batting third in the lineup. Brian felt an immense sense of pride in both boys' progress. One thing Brian couldn't ignore was the increased attention he was getting from some of the other kids' mothers. His jokes seemed to land a little too well, drawing laughter that lingered longer than expected, and his efforts with the team often received glowing praise. Some mothers even baked treats for the group, but always ensured Brian got a special portion, no matter what was made. As Tim's bond with Scooter grew, so did Brian's connection with Scooter's mother, Gertrude. She struck Brian as intelligent and witty, and they began spending more time together. One afternoon, curiosity got the better of him, and he decided to ask her about the recent attention he'd been receiving. "Gertrude, can I ask you something a little personal?" Brian began cautiously. "You're not about to ask my bra size, are you?" Gertrude quipped without missing a beat. "What? No, I wasn't going to ask that," Brian stammered, taken aback. "Well, men usually preface personal questions like that," she teased with a sly grin. "Fair enough," Brian conceded with a laugh. "But what I really wanted to know is if you've noticed how some of the moms have been acting around me. Don't they seem, I don't know, a little extra friendly?" Gertrude smirked. "You're just now catching on? Let me spell it out for you. The friendliest moms on the team, they're all single. To them, you're a great dad, a nice guy, and gainfully employed. That makes you prime real estate in their eyes. But I'm married," Brian pointed out. "Wouldn't that be a deal breaker?" "They're aware," Gertrude explained. "That's why nobody's made a serious move. Yet. But it doesn't mean they're not interested. Nobody's crossed a line, right?" "No, nothing like that," Brian replied. "But still, I'm not available. End of story." Gertrude hesitated before continuing. "I hate being the one to tell you this, but we're friends, so here goes. Everyone knows Brenda is cheating on you, and there's a rumor that she's cut you off entirely. Word is, your marriage is on borrowed time, and these women are just waiting for the breakup to swoop in. Brian was stunned. How could anyone know something so personal? Who's been talking about my private life? Then it dawned on him. It's Grant. Brenda must have told him, and he couldn't keep his mouth shut. Do you mean Brenda or her lover? Gertrude joked, trying to lighten the mood. Seriously, though, you don't look too shocked. Did you already suspect Brenda of cheating? I didn't suspect it, Brian clarified. I knew. I caught them together in our bed. That erased all doubt. Gertrude was incredulous. You walked in on them? And you stayed married? You didn't punch him or her? No, I decided my priority was Tim. I wanted to be there for him, so staying in the same house with Brenda seemed like the best way. I moved into the apartment above the garage under the pretext of needing quiet for my night shifts. Brenda wasn't thrilled, but Grant convinced her that any closeness with me would mean he'd lose access to their bed. That was enough to keep her away from me. That's insane, Gertrude fumed. Brenda's behavior is awful, and Grant sounds like a complete idiot. For what it's worth, every single mom on this team thinks you're a catch. Brian shook his head with a faint smile. You're overestimating my appeal. I'm just a regular guy. Don't sell yourself short, Gertrude countered. You're smart, kind, and great with kids. If I weren't so plain and flat-chested, I'd have already made my move. Brian chuckled. Thanks for being honest with me. I had no idea I was the talk of the team, or that so many people knew about my situation. It's humiliating. You're doing your best to be a good dad, and that's admirable, Gertrude said firmly. And for the record, Horace thinks you're pretty cool, too. Who's Horace? Brian asked with a playful grin. Only someone as clueless as you would tease me about Horace after everything I've said, Gertrude replied with a smile. You're a great friend, Gertrude. Thanks for setting me straight, Brian said. I just hope Tim doesn't pick up on too much, she added. He knows something's off between you and Brenda. He'll figure it out eventually. Gertrude hesitated before adding, You know, Scooter's got a crush on Heather Grant. It's awkward, but she's a sweet girl. Too bad her dad's such an idiot. Let's hope Tim sticks to Holly Ingram, Brian said. At least that's a drama-free option. Holly's definitely got her eye on him, Gertrude agreed. And she's a good kid from a good family. Maybe something nice will come out of this mess. 2 nights later, Tim's team faced off in the first round of the district championship. As the game drew near, Brian realized he was probably more anxious than his son. Adding to his discomfort, the usual trio of single moms seemed particularly determined to grab his attention. Norma Wilson had chosen a revealing top that showcased her ample cleavage, frequently leaning toward Brian under the pretense of picking something up or looking for something nearby. He couldn't deny that she had an impressive figure. Brandy Dorn, on the other hand, opted for a snug sweater that highlighted her slim waist and curvy silhouette. While she didn't show as much skin, her form-fitting outfit ensured she caught Brian's eye. She kept him engaged by asking countless questions about the team and its players. Then there was Jillian Patterson, who was the least subtle of the group. She stood so close to Brian that her chest frequently pressed against his arm or side whenever she spoke to him. Amused, Gertrude handed Brian a soda and a hot dog before retreating to her usual spot near first base. Shortly after, Brian noticed that all 3 women abruptly left his side at the same time. He found it odd, until he heard a familiar voice behind him. "Well, look at this," Brenda announced loudly. "I decided to join my husband today and watch my son play. I didn't realize I'd have to wade through his fan club to get to him. What's going on, Brian?" she added, her tone sharp. "The game hasn't started yet, but Tim did great during batting practice," Brian replied, carefully steering the conversation away from her implied accusation. "Nice dodge," Brenda snapped. "What's with all these women swarming around you like bees to honey? It's good you don't have a silicone allergy." "If you're asking me to explain the mysteries of the female mind, you're out of luck," Brian said with a shrug. "I don't have a clue. Honestly, I'm surprised to see you here." "Tim's playing an important game," Brenda replied firmly. "Of course I'm here to support him, though clearly some of the other moms are here for more than just their kids." "You've been too busy for Tim's games before," Brian remarked. "How'd you manage to fit this one into your schedule?" Brenda stiffened at his pointed comment, momentarily wondering if he was hinting at something. The thought quickly passed. If Brian suspected anything, he'd be far more confrontational. One thing she was certain of, Brian wouldn't tolerate betrayal. If he knew, she'd have no doubt about it. "I made time," Brenda said coolly. This game is important to Tim, and that makes it important to me. Plus, it's been a while since I've seen you with your night shifts, so I figured we could cheer him on together. As they settled into the bleachers, Brenda noticed several other mothers glancing in her direction, their expressions less than welcoming. She couldn't understand why they seemed hostile. This was her first game, and she'd barely spoken to them. Then she spotted Gertrude sitting nearby. Unlike the others, Gertrude wasn't flashy, but Brenda couldn't help but notice her toned legs in shorts that seemed a little daring for the cool evening weather. The game soon began, and Brian's attention shifted entirely to the field. After 2 quick strikeouts, Tim stepped up to bat. Brenda's nerves spiked when the first pitch flew dangerously close to Tim's head. The second pitch, though low and outside, was met with a solid swing. Tim sent the ball flying, landing a stand-up double. Next, Scooter came to the plate. Brenda was struck by how much he'd matured. He seemed stronger and more self-assured than the shy boy she remembered from the previous summer. The first pitch zipped near Scooter's head, but he stood his ground, preparing for the next. Brian chuckled softly. "Trying to scare these two is a bad call," he muttered, almost to himself. "I just hope the pitcher tries to sneak a fastball past Scooter." The pitcher delivered, adding extra power to his throw. The sharp crack of Scooter's bat meeting the ball echoed through the stands. The crowd erupted as the ball sailed over the center field fence. Tim jogged home, grinning as he exchanged high fives with Scooter at the plate. Gertrude beamed, her pride evident. Glancing at Brian, she saw tears glistening in his eyes. She knew how much time he'd spent helping Tim and Scooter improve their skills. The joy and pride he felt were palpable. She was deeply grateful for the impact Brian had on Scooter's confidence and growth. Brenda, however, sat stiffly, her attention divided. Her unease grew as she watched Brian and Gertrude, while also noting that the 2 women who had previously hovered around him were now retreating. Elsewhere, Brenda's lover, Bill, was growing impatient. "Are you seriously telling me you haven't slept with Brian since the day we hooked up at your house?" he asked incredulously. "You are the one who suggested I avoid him for as long as possible," Brenda shot back. "He started working nights, moved into the apartment above the garage, and now we barely even say hello, let alone anything else." "That's insane," Bill said. "He's too young to just give up on Zex. Either he's gay or he's got someone else on the side." "Brian is not gay, and he's definitely not a cheater," Brenda insisted. "He's just focused on work and Tim's games, that's all." "No normal guy would willingly give up a woman like you," Bill argued. "There's no way he isn't getting it somewhere." "Brian is a man of principle," Brenda replied defensively. "He'd never betray me like that." "And what do you think you're doing with me?" Bill shot back. "This is different," Brenda said, her voice softening. "It's just a little fun, something temporary. Brian's been so busy, and I deserve to enjoy myself too. I work hard at my job and taking care of the house. I've earned this." Bill smirked. "Fine, have it your way. We'll enjoy it while it lasts. Just let me know when I can really claim you. The thought of you in our bed still drives me wild." As Brenda replayed Bill's words in her mind, unease settled over her. She couldn't help but notice the 2 women who had been hovering around Brian slowly dispersing. It was impossible to ignore that these women were attractive, with enviable figures and confidence to match. Brenda realized she had to take action if she wanted to safeguard her marriage from potential threats. Her eyes fell on Gertrude, seated alone nearby. Inspiration struck, and Brenda decided to act quickly. Flashing a warm smile, she approached and sat down beside the surprised woman. "It's great to see you again, Gertrude," Brenda began cheerfully. "Horace has turned into such a talented baseball player and such a sweet boy. You must be really proud." "I am," Gertrude replied cautiously. "Tim's doing great too. All that time Brian spends with them has really paid off. He's been an incredible mentor to Horace." "Brian does have a knack for that," Brenda agreed, her tone turning strategic. "But sometimes he's almost too good. I'm sure you've noticed how those blonde women with, well, generous assets are always swarming around him. I need your help with something." Gertrude tilted her head, clearly intrigued. "What exactly do you have in mind? Should I hose them down when they get too close?" Brenda laughed lightly. "Not quite. You know I can't always be here for practices and games because of work. But I trust Brian around you. You're not his type at all. If you could just stay close to him when I'm not here, it would mean a lot. I'm going to tell Brian to stick by your side so those manipulative women think he's focused on you. It might be awkward at first, but you'd be helping to protect my marriage." Gertrude's eyebrows shot up. Let me make sure I've got this straight, she said dryly. You're worried that these attractive single moms might seduce Brian, so you want me to act as a decoy? Basically, you think I'm safe because I'm, what, plain and flat-chested? That's not what I said, Brenda protested. I just know Brian. He's far less likely to develop feelings for someone like you than for some former cheerleader with a perfect figure. This is about keeping him faithful. Gertrude leaned back thoughtfully. Tell me something, Brenda. If Brian did cheat, would it be a deal breaker for you? Or could you live with him having a fling as long as you stayed his number one? I hope you're joking, Brenda said, her tone sharp. I love Brian, but infidelity would be the end. It's not just about the act. It's a betrayal of our marriage vows. I'd never tolerate it. Once that line is crossed, the marriage is over. Surely you understand that. You were married for years. You know what loyalty means. Gertrude nodded slowly. I get it. Cheating does undermine the entire foundation of marriage. I can see why you feel that way. Brenda softened. I appreciate you understanding. So can I count on you to help? Just keep an eye on him when I can't. Oh, absolutely, Gertrude replied with a sly smile. Be sure to explain all this to Brian, though. I'll do my part. Who better to keep a man celibate than someone as safe as me? Brenda smiled, ignoring the sarcasm. Thanks, Gertrude. I knew I could trust you. With that, she stood and headed off to join her husband. At practice the next day, Brian brought it up. Brenda wanted to talk last night before I left for work. Long story short, she thinks I'm surrounded by too many attractive single moms. Her solution? She wants me to stick close to you, Minx. Or, as she calls you, Gertrude. Gertrude laughed. Why don't I feel safer? You know as well as I do that no man is truly safe around any woman, no matter how ordinary she might seem. Minx, you're one of the most beautiful women I have ever known, Brian said sincerely. You're the full package, not just some superficial combination of bleach and implants. Gertrude blushed, looking both amused and flustered. Well, you just made my job a lot harder. I'll have to schedule an eye exam for you once baseball season's over. Brian chuckled. You'll find my vision is perfectly fine. I just seem to have misjudged one thing, my wife. Gertrude smirked. Maybe she misjudged us too, assuming you're serious about finding me attractive. Brian laughed softly at her reaction, spending much of the practice joking and chatting with her. The other parents noticed, and their reactions ranged from disbelief to disappointment. In just one session, Gertrude's presence had effectively set him apart from the crowd. The team's next game required a 3-hour trip to Middleburg. To ensure the boys were well rested, they decided to travel the night before and stay at a hotel. Brian gave a ride to Jake Winston's parents and Gertrude, and much of the drive was spent discussing the team's prospects in the district and state championships. When they arrived at the hotel, Brian helped the Winstons with their luggage. The parents volunteering as chaperones were staying with the team, while others had to find accommodations elsewhere due to the high number of visitors in town for the games. Before Tim joined the rest of the team, Brian reminded him to behave and assured him he'd be there for practice the next morning. What hotel are you staying at, Minx? Brian asked as the Winstons checked in. The same one as you, she replied simply. I never mentioned where I'm staying. How do you know? Brian asked, puzzled. I didn't, Gertrude said with a mischievous smile. Brian shook his head, still confused, as they arrived at his hotel. Minx, why don't you see if there's a room available while I check in? I'll wait to make sure you find something. No need, Gertrude replied, grinning. I'll be fine. Only when Brian returned to the truck with his room key did things begin to click. He looked at Gertrude. Would you like one of these keys? I'm in room 207. What a thoughtful offer, she said with a playful smile, taking the card and kissing him lightly on the cheek. Now, let's get settled. We've got a long night ahead of us. The next morning, Brian woke up feeling even more exhausted than when he had gone to bed. As the reality of breaking his marriage vows hit him, he wrestled with his conscience. Fortunately, Gertrude, affectionately nicknamed Minx, helped him process his emotions. Let's look at this rationally, Minx began. Brenda not only cheated on you but agreed to cut off your physical relationship. Even if she hadn't, she's putting your health at risk by having unprotected sex with her lover. She's essentially made closeness with her unsafe and undesirable. That alone frees you from your vows. Plus, I haven't been with anyone in over 2 years, and I've been tested. I'm clean. You were tested after finding out about her affair, so I know you're fine too. I've even been on the pill for over a month, hoping this would happen. Can you give me one valid reason why we shouldn't be together? Or is it just that you don't find me attractive? Her voice softened as she continued. Your wife picked me as a decoy because she thought I was plain and wouldn't appeal to you. Am I really that undesirable? Minx, don't ever say that, Brian said, his tone firm. You're incredibly attractive. I've never cheated on Brenda before, so this is an adjustment for me. But you make a strong case, and I'm ready now, he added with a small grin. There's something you should know first, Minx said, her expression serious. Both of my parents are in hospice care and don't have much time left. Also, my brother has been sharing Horace's baseball footage with a friend who coaches at one of the top prep schools in Los Angeles. If Horace earns a scholarship for next year, we'll probably be moving back. I like you a lot, Brian, but we can't plan for anything long-term. This can't last forever. You're a married man whose wife has been unfaithful, and I'm a single mom focused on giving my son the best opportunities. I have to put Horace first. I'm happy for Scooter, Brian replied sincerely. He's a great kid and a talented player. He deserves to play at a top-tier school and get a great education. You've done an amazing job raising him and giving him this chance. The irony, Minx said with a wry smile, is that your mentorship gave Horace this opportunity, but it also means we might have to leave you behind. Brian paused thoughtfully. I don't think I'm built for a one-night stand. Maybe it's better to give up sex entirely than to experience it once and go back to being celibate. You're ridiculous, Minx said with a laugh. I said we'd probably move in 6 months. That's plenty of time for us, unless, of course, you think you're too old for 6 months of amazing sex with a very eager woman. Well, I guess we'll just have to find out, Brian teased. Think you can live up to your nickname, Minx? Oh, I'll show you exactly why I earned it, she promised. Just whistle when you need me. I'll even teach you how to whistle properly. I've always been told I'm pretty good at whistling, Brian joked. Then you're doing it wrong, Minx shot back with a smirk. The baseball team went on to win the state championship, and Scooter earned a scholarship to a prestigious prep school in California. Just before Thanksgiving, both of Gertrude's parents passed away within a week of each other. Brian and Tim attended their funeral, where Brian met Gertrude's brother. Brian, this is my brother Dexter, Gertrude introduced. Dexter, meet Brian, Horace's mentor and our good friend. Dexter? Seriously? Brian said, surprised. Yep, her brother replied with a grin. Only Gertrude and my parents call me Dexter. Everyone else knows me as Grim. What do you call her? Scamp, Brian said. Don't ask me why. I don't think I need to, Grim said with a laugh. Thanksgiving brought Brian back to Brenda's parents' house with Tim. That evening, as they prepared for bed, Brian found himself in an unfamiliar position. Brenda seemed interested in rekindling their physical relationship. It's been a long time, Brenda cooed, slipping into bed. You must be missing this. Let's make love. Brian hesitated, his response laced with sarcasm. Are you finally admitting you need some attention? I knew you'd come around. I'd be happy to put a smile on your face for the holiday. Her expression darkened instantly. You're such an idiot. With that attitude, don't expect me to try again anytime soon. Okay, Brian said simply, rolling over. Though his remark was uncharacteristic, it achieved his goal, avoiding closeness with Brenda. Still, it saddened him to see how far their marriage had deteriorated. Brenda lay awake, troubled by his comment. Was he aware of her affair, or was he just frustrated by their lack of closeness? She resolved to talk to Bill, her lover, about it. She needed to keep up appearances with Brian to avoid raising suspicions. Brian's routine while working the night shift remained consistent. After finishing his shift, he'd head home for a small breakfast and go to bed by 9 a.m. By early afternoon, Minx often slipped into his bed, her intentions clear. They'd spend an hour together before she left to be home when Horace returned from school. With baseball season over, Brian found more time for himself in the evenings before work. Despite the complications, this arrangement worked well for both Brian and Minx, for the time being. One evening in early December, Brian had just settled into his shift at work when his phone buzzed. It was Tim. Dad, Scooter and I are hanging out with Heather and Holly in Heather's car. You said we could stay out until midnight since there's no school tomorrow, but we've got a problem, Tim said, his voice anxious. Heather was driving her mom's car and we got a flat tire. There's no spare in the trunk. We're stuck on D Street and it's making me nervous. A few guys at the arcade across the street keep looking over here. Brian's frustration was immediate. Are you seriously stuck on D Street near the damn arcade? He snapped. We'll talk about this later. Is Heather driving that Corolla? Yeah, it's a 2017 Corolla, Tim confirmed quickly. All right, Brian said, calming himself. I'll find a tire and be there soon. Keep the doors locked and don't get out. If anything happens, call the police. Look out for those girls, okay? After hanging up, Brian headed to the production floor in search of a solution. Spotting Gus operating a forklift, he walked over. "Gus, you've still got that Corolla, right?" Brian asked. "I need a tire that'll fit, and I need it now." Gus looked up, surprised but cooperative. "Yeah, I've got a real spare, not one of those flimsy donuts. Let's grab it and go." As Gus got ready, Brian saw Jack Reynolds walking by. Jack was Holly's uncle, her mother's younger brother. "Jack," Brian called out, "Tim and some friends, including Holly, are stranded on D Street with a flat tire and no spare. Gus has a tire, and I'm heading over there now. Can you come with me?" Jack's face tightened with concern. "Absolutely. Let's go." The three men hurried out to Gus's car, all aware of how dangerous that area could be at night, especially for teenagers. Meanwhile, Brenda was lying in bed, basking in the afterglow of her time with Bill when his phone rang. He glanced at the caller ID and groaned. "It's Heather. If I don't pick up, she'll give me hell for ignoring her," Bill muttered as he answered. Brenda could only hear his side of the conversation, but quickly became uneasy. "What are you kids doing there?" Bill demanded. "Well, that's tough. You boys are old enough to handle a flat tire. Call AAA or something and tell your mom to put a damn spare in the trunk next time." After hanging up, Bill dismissed Brenda's curiosity. "Nothing serious," he said casually, reaching for her. "Heather got a flat, but she said 8AA's handling it." Back on D Street, the tension was thick. A group of young men loitered near Heather's car as Gus's vehicle pulled up. Brian wasted no time, grabbing the jack and tire iron from Gus's trunk and getting to work. Gus brought the spare tire, and Jack approached the driver's window, motioning for Heather to roll it down. "Stay in the car," Jack instructed firmly. "We'll handle the tire. If those guys get any ideas, we'll take care of it. Holly, you're going to have a lot of explaining to do when your mom finds out you were here." Brian positioned the jack under the car and secured it in place. As he started loosening the lug nuts, one of the men from the group swaggered over, clearly looking for trouble. "You're on our turf," the man sneered. "You don't touch anything without my say-so." Before Jack could reply, Brian swung the tire iron into the thug's shins with a sharp crack. The man collapsed, groaning in pain. Brian dragged him by the collar, pinned him face down near the flat tire, and sat on his back while continuing to work. Two others from the group rushed forward, but Jack intercepted the first, landing a solid blow to the man's head and knocking him to the ground. The second hesitated as Gus stepped forward, his imposing presence enough to make the guy think twice. "Keep cranking the jack," Brian said to Jack calmly as he finished removing the flat tire. The thug beneath him tried to squirm free, but Brian grabbed a fistful of his greasy hair, pushed his head back to the pavement, and growled, "Stay still." With the new tire in place, Brian tightened the lug nuts and gestured for Jack to lower the car. As he stepped over the gang leader to return the tools, his foot accidentally landed in the man's groin, earning a pained howl. Brian turned to the rest of the group, casually tossing the tire iron from hand to hand. "You guys have something to say?" he asked, stepping forward. The gang scattered without another word. "Get out of here," Jack told the teens firmly as Brian waved them off, "and stay out of this neighborhood. You're lucky this time." The men climbed back into Gus's car and followed Heather's vehicle until it reached a safer area, then headed back to work. "You really cracked that guy's shins?" Gus asked, laughing as they drove. "He went down like a sack of potatoes." "Thanks for letting me tag along," Jack said, rubbing his arm. "That punch felt good, but I'll probably feel it tomorrow." "And you, sitting on him while changing the tire. Classic," Gus added, grinning. Their late-night adventure had become the talk of the plant. Tales of courage and quick thinking were always a hit, especially on the night shift, providing a welcome distraction and plenty of entertainment for everyone. The next morning, Brian woke up groggy, only to find Minx slipping into bed beside him. She kissed him deeply, her intentions unmistakable. She was completely without clothes, her desire palpable. "Horace told me what happened last night," she said breathlessly. "You were amazing, Brian. Thank you for taking care of the kids. You've earned this. I would have come earlier, but I had to wait for Horace and Tim to head out. They're visiting the girls since there's no school today." Meanwhile, Brenda had barely been at work an hour when Sue Blaine approached her at the water cooler, her expression eager to share something. "Did you hear about last night?" Sue began, her voice low but animated. "Brian, Jack Reynolds, and Gus Benson apparently stepped in to deal with some punks maltreating the kids on D Street. Word is Brian didn't hesitate to use a tire iron to teach one of them a lesson." Brenda's stomach dropped as the pieces fell into place. Last night, Heather had called her father for help, and Bill had brushed her off like it was nothing. Clearly, the situation had been more serious than he'd let on. Sue's use of the word kids confirmed that Tim, Holly, and Horace had been there too. Feigning ignorance, Brenda replied, "That's quite a story. What exactly have you heard? I want to make sure the rumors are accurate." Sue recounted the tale in vivid detail, and by the time she finished, Brenda was seething. Beneath her calm exterior, anger burned. At Bill for abandoning his daughter in her moment of need, and at herself for getting involved with such a selfish, useless man. While Bill ignored Heather's plea for help, Brian and his co-workers had stepped up to protect the kids, putting themselves at risk. That was what real men did. The contrast was stark and painful. The realization hit her like a freight train. She had been cheating on Brian, her husband, a good man, with someone who wouldn't even lift a finger for his own daughter. What had she been thinking? Brian was 10 times the man Bill would ever be, and deep down, she'd always known it. Later that morning, Brenda found Bill in the break room casually enjoying a snack while his delivery truck was being serviced. Without hesitation, she confronted him. "Heather called you for help last night and you just ignored her?" Brenda demanded. "Those kids were in a dangerous situation and you told her to call AAA? What kind of father does that?" "Relax," Bill replied dismissively. "Your husband and his buddies handled it. Everyone's fine. So, what's the big deal?" "The big deal," Brenda shot back, her voice rising, "is that Brian acted like a man while you sat here doing nothing. My son was in that car, and you couldn't be bothered to help." Bill smirked, unfazed. "If your husband's so great, why are you sleeping with me instead of him?" Brenda's temper snapped. "You're pathetic. Brian's more of a man than you'll ever be. This thing between us, it's over. Don't speak to me again." "Your loss," Bill said coolly, leaning back in his chair. "Plenty of women would eliminate for what I bring to the table. When you change your mind, you know where to find me." Brenda turned and stormed out, tears stinging her eyes. She had betrayed her husband and risked her family for a man who didn't even care about his own daughter. She could only pray Brian never found out how foolish she had been. She knew she had a lot of work to do to fix her mistakes. Back at Brian's house, Minx had just finished dressing when she noticed Brenda standing in the doorway, her face streaked with tears. "How could you do this to me?" Brenda cried. "I trusted both of you, and this is how you repay me?" Minx, unfazed, calmly reached for her shirt. "I'm just following through on your plan," she said lightly. "You wanted me to keep those busty blondes away from Brian, so I made the ultimate sacrifice. Mission accomplished." "I never wanted you to sleep with him," Brenda shouted, her anger boiling over. "And Brian, you cheated on me with this plain, skinny little—" "Watch it," Minx interrupted sharply. "Your husband was miserable, Brenda. I was just helping relieve the pressure you and Bill created. Speaking of Bill, where is he? Warming your bed while Brian was out saving your son." Brenda froze, her face flushing. "You know about Bill?" "Oh, everyone knows," Minx replied breezily. "You've been with him for months. You stopped sleeping with your husband because Bill didn't want to share." "How generous of him." Brenda's voice dropped to a whisper. "If Brian knew, why didn't he confront me? Why did he let it go on for so long?" Minx crossed her arms. "Think about it. What do most men do when they find out their wife's cheating?" Brenda swallowed hard. "They'd get angry, probably leave, maybe file for divorce." "Exactly. What's next, Brenda? Do Brian and Tim stay here while you move in with Bill?" Minx asked, her tone calm and matter-of-fact. "I wouldn't move out of my house," Brenda replied firmly. "And I wouldn't give up custody of Tim either. If Brian wanted a divorce, he'd be the one to leave. He'd still have to pay alimony and child support, and Tim would stay with me." "That's precisely what Brian anticipated," Minx said with a nod. "His priority has always been staying close to Tim and being the best father he can. How do you think he managed to achieve that?" "Because he won't divorce me," Brenda admitted, her voice dropping. "He stayed for Tim, not for me. When he found out about Bill and me, it was like he divorced me emotionally. We've been living as strangers under the same roof for months now. I was just too blind to see it." "To be fair, Bill made it easier for you not to notice," Minx pointed out. "Then I came along just a skinny witch, as you've called me. After you'd already burned the bridge with Brian, I'm the one helping him move on." "I told Bill it's over," Brenda said firmly. "I don't want anything more to do with him." "Let me guess," Minx replied with a hint of sarcasm. "That epiphany hit after he blew off Heather's call for help last night. You didn't have much of a choice, did you?" "Are you and Brian planning to move in together now?" Brenda asked, wiping her tear-streaked face. "Not at all," Minx said plainly. We're happy with things as they are. Besides, Horace and I will be moving back to Los Angeles before school starts in the fall. I'd prefer if my son didn't know his mom was, let's say, having a fling with his best friend's dad. When the time comes, I'll probably help Brian find someone new, if he wants my input. What if I don't let this continue? Brenda said, her tone defiant. He's still my husband. You have no right to sleep with him. You forfeited that right the moment you started sleeping with Bill, Minx replied, her voice calm but sharp. That effectively freed Brian from any obligation to you. Unlike you, Brian and I can trust each other, if you can even imagine that. He knows he can't be with you or anyone else as long as I'm here. That's the deal. Brenda's face crumpled as tears began falling again. Who knows what Bill has done behind my back, she said shakily. What if he's been with someone else? What if I've put myself at risk? Her voice broke as the realization set in. I need to get tested. Minx's expression didn't soften. Smart idea, she said coolly. What happens now? Brenda asked hesitantly. We keep things as they are, Minx said with a shrug. I'll visit Brian when I can. You keep working late and avoiding him. If it isn't broken, why fix it? I can't do that, Brenda said firmly, her voice gaining strength. You're leaving in a few months. I'll stay and show Brian that I can be the wife he deserves. He won't need you anymore. Minx smirked. Except he knows my skinny A, as you like to call it, has been loyal to him, unlike yours, which has been out there waiting for anyone willing to pat it. Honestly, I control your bed life, or at least the part involving Brian. I won't let him get near you as long as we're together. I don't want to risk catching something. And truthfully, neither does he. Brenda straightened her shoulders, forcing confidence into her voice. Relationships are about more than just sex, she said. Sex without love or commitment is hollow and degrading. I'll do everything a wife should do for her husband while you're just a fling. Let's see where that leaves you. Minx raised an eyebrow. Fine, she said, amused. You cook him a fantastic lasagna, scrub the toilets, and make sure his clothes are clean. Meanwhile, I'll make him smile in bed. We'll see which of us he prefers. Brenda turned to Brian, her voice trembling with desperation. Brian, I'm so ashamed. I'm sorry for everything I've done to hurt you. Can you ever forgive me? Minx interjected, her tone cutting. Forgiveness is one thing. Trust? That's a different story. How do you plan to regain his trust after you've destroyed it? That's the problem every traitor faces. Here's my advice. Enjoy the next few months while you're still Brian's wife in name only. Use that time to reflect on what you gave up for mediocre sex with Bill. Once Tim graduates, Brian will likely show you the door. Brenda turned back to Brian, pleading. Why do you let her speak for you? Minx answered for him, her voice steady. Because I'm not just his lover, I'm his best friend. While you were off whispering sweet nothings to Bill, Brian and I were building a real connection. Now, if you don't mind, could you leave us? We have things to discuss. She pressed a finger to Brian's lips, signaling him to remain silent as Brenda reluctantly left the room.